Hello, everyone, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today virtually. Thank you very much for coming and joining us today. My name is Kate Crawford, and I'm a partner in and the national business leader of BLG's Health Law Group. As COVID testing becomes more widely available, and we all eagerly anticipate the distribution of the vaccine based on the priority schedule that's set in each of our jurisdictions, we've gathered together a panel of legal experts to discuss the questions, risks, and issues that business owners and employers may run into regarding testing, tracing, and in managing vaccine rollout. During today's discussion, I invite you to submit any specific questions you have to our subject matter experts directly into the chat, and a member of the panel will be able to respond in real time. If you have more in-depth questions that you would like to discuss, please connect with us through LinkedIn Messenger or by phone or email through our website at blg.com. Our first panelist, Dan, is a new partner at BLG with a privacy and education sector practice and is well known to his clients and the market for his security and risk management work. He's been helping employers and educational institutions create and adjust their screening and response policies since last March. Idona Avila focuses on advocating for clients in a variety of commercial disputes and advising on compliance and risk management across industries. Idona has been a trusted advisor to her clients in managing the variety of challenges faced by the pandemic and throughout 2020. With the benefit of serving different industries, Idona has advised clients on product labeling and marketing of COVID-19 supplies, back to business practices and procedures, and insurance issues. James Fu is a partner in our labor and employment group. James authored one of our firm's very first COVID-19 pandemic articles in early March of last year, before the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, fittingly and presciently titling it Employer Strategies for Managing Novel Coronavirus Risks in the Workplace, which continues to be good reading today. James has been helping employers manage their businesses both prior to the pandemic and throughout the pandemic, including creating COVID-19 safety policies, procedures, and plans, advising on COVID-19 governmental assistance programs, and advising on the rights of employers to require that their employees be vaccinated. And finally, Eva Krajewska is a partner in our disputes practice who provides strategic advice to businesses and public institutions who are facing or trying to avoid litigation. During the pandemic, Eva has developed an expertise on emergency legislation and has argued cases and presents frequently on the topic. Eva is a co-chair of our appellate advocacy group and has argued appeals at the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. So why don't we get started? And Dan, I'd like to start with you. Let's talk a little bit about testing. So as matters evolve, it seems that testing services are becoming more available or more widely available. Can an employer require an employee to be tested?
Thanks, Kate. There's a risk, certainly, but it's not of a degree or it is of a degree, I'd say, that would be acceptable for some employers, particularly those in healthcare and congregate living settings. I'll explain shortly, though. By saying that testing is required, it's to tell employees you must submit to this test to come to work and be paid. It's aggressive because you're indirectly compelling a bodily intrusion. I've been swabbed. I don't know if you've been swabbed, but it's not the most pleasant experience one can have. Notwithstanding that, though, we've already seen one case in which a labor arbitrator has upheld a retirement home's mandatory testing program. That decision doesn't bind any other arbitrator, but it tells us that our extraordinary safety needs today may permit us to mandate testing in some circumstances.
Fair enough. What about tracing, Dan? So does an organization who learns about an infection on its premises have an obligation in today's world to trace and notify anyone who might have been exposed in the workplace or within the organization?
Yeah, good one. The better answer is yes, I think. And it's a bit remarkable. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, many argued that an employer ought not handle the sensitive information required to identify potential exposures in the workplace. And they argued that that's what public health is to do for us, right? many or most employers rejected that view, and I think they rightly understood that there were timing and other problems with just waiting to rely on public health. And they went ahead and they implemented exposure notification protocol that required them to collect information about where people are during the workday. In the campus context, interestingly, universities and colleges are now tracking location using technology. So they need that data about location, and then they need to know when people become sick with COVID, because that triggers the exposure notification process, which they've done. And they've done it in a way where they've tried, in most cases, successfully not to identifying anyone who's sick. All very standard now. It became over time consistent with public health guidance, and I would argue that it's arguably required under our health and safety legislation.
Well, and that gives me a nice segue to my next question, which I'm going to ask Donna to comment on. If we take Dan's advice and assume that there's some obligation to do some tracing, now, granted, not necessarily in the employment context, can I restrict entrance to my premises on the basis of proof of vaccination?
Interesting question, and it's certainly a question that has been on the mind, Kate, on the mind of business leaders and risk managers since at least the vaccine approval announcements. Now, all an occupier of a premises has, at least under the common law, a fundamental right to control entry to its premises, including how obviously activities are carried out on those premises. The ability for such a restriction on the basis, say, in this case, would be the feature of mandating vaccination for them to enter in the premises. For that kind of restriction to ultimately be found enforceable in a court of law will largely be fact specific. And for those joining us today, will not be surprised by that kind of answer, because I'll say every time I ask a lawyer, they tell me it depends. So, of course, as businesses have modified their operations in the context of the pandemic, they've already put in place a number of restrictions. We saw, obviously, the debate that emerged in the context of a requirement to mask in public places, including inside the business's premises early on in the pandemic, and certainly public health guidance and direction assisted with legitimizing those kinds of practices. So the masking restriction at the time, which businesses deployed as part of sort of a restriction to enter their premises. All in all, I think much will depend on whether the entity is a private or a public entity, with the latter, of course, facing constitutional concerns for an added level of complexity for the mandatory vaccination sort of restriction. Certainly, as Dan alluded to, the particular industry that the entity operates in, and whether the restriction for mandatory vaccination is made vis-a-vis employees, so restricting employees for that kind of restriction, versus members of the public, say, entering the premises. And of course, much will also depend on whether the entity already has a vaccination policy in place. Say, for example, in daycares. Daycares have vaccination policies, and how that may be molded in the context of COVID will depend on what's already there. With the option, for example, facing by many businesses, I guess, at this juncture in the pandemic, to mandate a vaccination policy, encourage vaccination, or ultimately say nothing at all, be silent, and no policy on vaccination whatsoever.
Well, you again led me to a great segue and this discussion around employees and vaccination. And so I'm going to turn this question to James. James, can I require an employee of mine to get vaccinated? The $1 million question.
Yeah, that's right. That is the $1 million question. So it's the answer is going to be, as Adona was saying, it depends. I think it's a lot of context, right? As most situations, based on the context. So what I mean by that, practically speaking, is in some settings it may be appropriate for the employer to require employees to demonstrate that they have been vaccinated, or else, for example, there can be consequences that are set out. And those settings may be, for example, in some of the very high-risk settings. There is a case, it was in the influenza context, but there is a case where a registered practical nurse refused to be vaccinated under a mandatory vaccination policy. And they were, and the employer in that case argued that the employee was terminated for just cause, and they had grounds to do so. The Canada Labour Code adjudicator agreed in that case, but it was a very special case that's really one of the only, cases out there. Outside of that context, where it's a high risk, it's probably going to be a bit difficult for employers to require employees to be vaccinated in order to work. Now, that's not to say that there can't be conditions that are set out in certain situations, but that's the short answer. Now, the Human Rights Tribunal, Commission actually, because the tribunal is the body that makes decisions, the commission is the body that sets out the policies in general. And the Human Rights Commission has indicated in their policy that one thing to consider definitely is religious creed rights of individuals, and also disability potentially, and potentially other grounds as well too. But those have to be factored into the analysis if, for example, an employer does put in place a policy, a mandatory vaccination policy. And the Human Rights Commission has indicated that, similar to what we've been discussing right now, is it may be appropriate in some circumstances that vaccination may be mandatory or required as a condition of the job, in a sense, to a certain limit. But again, that is the $1 million question, and it's on a lot of our minds.
Well, and James, does it make a difference if you're talking about a unionized versus a non-unionized environment?
That's a very good point. So reasonability is usually what we look at in terms of most situations, the context, and definitely in the unionized context. For those viewers who are in unionized context, you may know the term KVP. That the KVP case, that's the approach. Essentially, it boils down to whether the policy was reasonable, communicated, et cetera, But you look at those factors. In a non-unionized setting, I think you would look at similar factors. Of course, in a unionized setting, we would have the additional overlay of the union that would be involved, and there's a grievance process in which any grievances can be put forward, and then an arbitration potentially. But yes, the short answer to the question is there is nuances. But at the end of the day, I think reasonability is going to be a key point.
While we're talking about employees, Adona, I have a question for you. What about insurance policies? So if we're talking about health benefits, for example, and health benefits that employees have access to or the benefit of, do we anticipate or could providers or these policies restrict coverage on the basis of an employee's vaccination status?
Yeah, interestingly, for the folks practicing in the sort of the insurance space, and specifically in the various sort of insurance products, specialized insurance product markets, these kinds of questions came on early on in the pandemic when it came to sort of coverage for, in the case of somebody contracting coronavirus and having all these kinds of side effects of it and not being able to return to work. I think when it comes to using the vaccination, whether you were vaccinated or not, as a basis for denying coverage, say you get COVID later on and you fail to get the vaccine, I think would be a hard sell. Because ultimately it's going to depend on the terms of the contract, and so the terms of the policy, and it depends on sort of what kind of policy was in place at the time. So to the extent no contractual term was stipulated in this respect, I think it would not be a reasonable way to basically find that there's no coverage for that person because they failed to get the vaccine. So I think that's the short answer to that. Depends on the actual terms, but I would find it highly unlikely that somebody contemplated say 2 years ago to enter in this particular sort of term that would vitiate coverage on the basis of not actually doing the vaccine.
Oh, fair enough. While we're, I suppose, on the topic of vaccines, and obviously we're all talking about them a lot, Eva, what about vaccine-related injuries? Is there anything out there? Is there some kind of a compensation scheme or anything like that if a person, employee or otherwise, is injured as a result of getting the vaccine?
So not yet, but there is a plan. So the federal government announced in December that it is going to create with the provinces a compensation scheme if a person is injured while receiving one of the COVID vaccines. And what it announced is that it's going to be based on the Quebec program. And Quebec has had this scheme for the last 30 years. where if you're injured while receiving any type of mandatory vaccination that kids need to go to school and stuff, like measles or smallpox or anything else, there is an administrative scheme. So it's different than a lawsuit, basically. You have to file a special claim before a special tribunal that has experts on it. You have to show that it's more likely than not that you suffered this injury as a result of the vaccine. And then this tribunal of experts provides you with compensation. That's how it works in Quebec. And the federal government wants to roll out that model across Canada. But it's going to need to roll that out in cooperation with the provinces, because this is what we call provincial sphere of jurisdiction. So it's going to have to roll it out with Ontario, with Nova Scotia, with Alberta. So that's in the works. But the last word on this is that it may not be kind of really out there in public until March, but it'll be retroactive to December. So when we started getting vaccines. And I think it's probably a very positive thing, because we talk about mandatory vaccines. So we're talking about, the stick, like telling people you need to get this because it's mandatory. But I think this is kind of a positive development, because, for people who are vaccine hesitant, maybe this will help them be like, if anything bad happens, which is highly, highly, highly unlikely, there is a compensation process that will be available to people to receive compensation for any injury. So I think it's a positive development, and I think we're all waiting to see what it's going to look like.
Well, and it's certainly something. It's a tool in an employer's tool belt that they can rely on if they think about trying to encourage employees to get vaccinated. Eva, have you had any other thoughts on what employers might do to encourage employees to get vaccinated?
I think the other elements here are, I think we just need to make it easier for employees to get vaccinated. So right now, the plan in Ontario, at least, is that in the spring, Ontario is going to open up mass vaccination clinics. And you may have seen that there was a pilot of one at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre in Toronto. But that requires people to go down there, maybe take a half day off work to get vaccinated. And for some people, that's a burden to do that. But Ontario also has a plan of creating mobile vaccination clinics for some essential high-risk workers, whether it's grocery stores or warehouses or others. And so I think, employers should be on the lookout for announcements from Toronto Public Health for those and facilitate those, because I think it's going to be much, much easier for people to get vaccinated if they can do it at their workplace. Just like, for the flu shot, many employers created flu shot vaccinations protocols, and that was great. So I think working jointly with public health to roll that out is going to be super helpful. But also, some employers may just want to say, I will give you half a day off to go get vaccinated, right? Like, I think that may be a very kind of responsible thing to do, because it will prevent having an outbreak. It'll prevent, loss of productivity. It'll prevent shutdowns, all of those things. So it may be a worthwhile economic investment to just make it easier for employees to get vaccinated.
Thanks, Eva. I've found this to be really helpful and really interesting. I'm mindful of the time, so I know that everyone's very busy, so I'd like to give each of you one more minute to tell me any final thoughts you've had, having listened and chatted with each other. Dan, why don't you start? Can't hear you, Dan.
Thanks. Sorry. In listening to everybody, I thought, you have the carrot and the stick. And I think we really, for the vast majority of employers, are going to be attracted to the carrot and all the things that Eva just talked about, paid time off and even messaging about the benefits and the duties of becoming vaccinated. And I think employers play a critical role in that and ought to get on board and save the stick for the really special cases, right?
Yeah, that's good advice anytime, Dan, I think. Adona, any final thoughts?
I think uncertainty has been a feature of this pandemic, and I think it's important to recognize that the law does not expect a standard of perfection. James alluded to this, and therefore, in the circumstances, businesses best be guided by standard of reasonableness and exert diligence in their approach to pandemic policies and procedures, and have confidence and comfort in that approach.
That is reassuring to think of it that way. James?
Yeah, and I the only thing I would add is, building on that, the comfort is many employers, I think, will want to look at their policies, right, in terms of vaccination policies or not, or encouragement, as Dan was saying, in terms of encouraging employees getting information. But most employers would have a COVID-19 safety plan right now. Once vaccination becomes more of a reality, once we have the supplies, employers should take a look at that and to determine whether or not that should be modified to account for this, especially in their hierarchy of controls and safety measures. And then also taking a look and seeing if any other COVID-19 policies need to be adjusted on that. But I think that would give employers additional comfort as well too.
And Eva, you get the final word. Anything to add?
I think I would just echo everyone else's comments that it's fighting the pandemic is kind of a joint effort, and we can't just look to government. We can't just look to employers. We also have to look at our individual responsibility. But if we're all able to work together reasonably, hopefully we do see the light at the end of this tunnel sooner rather than later.
Here. We couldn't end on a better note than that. So thank you to each of you for your time. I'm very grateful for it, and I'm sure that those who have joined us online are great as well. And thank you to everyone who's watching for coming out today. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any one of us, and we'll do anything we can to help.